Hello, students. Welcome to a class on a Wagner Matinee by Willa Cather. To talk about Willa Cather, she was born in the year 1873 and she passed away in the year 1947. To talk a little bit about Willa Cather and her life, at the age of 9, Virginia born Willa Cather, she moved to Nebraska with her family. So the prairies, that is the place where she moved to, the prairies, it challenged Cather a great deal, and also the other settlers who were with her. It kind of created an erasure of personality among these people. And it was a difficult transition for her to have moved from a city to a different place. Though they lived by hard physical labor, they were educated people, the people who were with her in the prairie. They introduced Cather to French and German literature, Latin and Greek. So, Nebraska and her childhood is something that we can see that goes round and round in her stories. So, Willa Cather was a journalist, she was a teacher, and also an editor. Now, around 1906, Cather moved to New York City and she began a full writing career. And the prairie, although she moved away from the prairies, the place where she spent her childhood, it was not far away from her work. She mentioned or she wrote about prairies in most of her works. Many of her 12 novels and 58 stories had prairie settings. So some of these characters in her stories, they were directly drawn from the real people Cather had known during her childhood, such as her childhood friend Annie, who formed the basis of the main character of one of her most popular novels titled My Antonia. Now, Willa Cather, she chose an artist's life. She once said to a friend that nothing mattered to her but writing books and living the kind of life that makes it possible to write them. And Willa Cather lived that life until her death in 1947. Now, moving on to the short story, A Wagner Matinee. We can see two settings in the short story. One is the prairie, which is situated in Nebraska, which is a rural setting. And then we have Boston, which is more like a city, is a bustling city. So there is Nebraska and Boston as the two setting in the short story. Now, about Wagner Matinee, as we discussed earlier, Wagner Matinee is written in a short story format by an American writer, Willa Cather, and it was first published in the Everybody's magazine. So, Cather, she sketches out a wasted life where a woman who left Boston to go and live on a remote farm. This woman, she experiences the music of Wagner for a first time when she returns to the city almost after 30 years. And that is when she realizes the character that we have in the short story, that is when she realizes that how much she has missed out on. So, a Wagner Matinee is more like a moving story about isolation, loss, and the distance between frontier life versus the metropolitan life of the American city. Now, to give you a plot summary of Wagner Matinee, the story is narrated by Clark. So, that is the name of the narrator that we have in the short story. It's Clark. And Clark is a man who lives in Boston who one day receives a letter from his uncle in Nebraska informing him that the narrator's aunt, who is named Georgiana, is leaving or traveling to Boston to settle the estate of a relative who has died, leaving her a legacy. So Clark comes to understand that his aunt, Georgiana, is coming to the city, Boston, for some affair. Remembering his aunt immediately causes Clark to recall his childhood in Nebraska, where he used to live with his aunt and uncle while he was a child. So he remembers about his childhood memories, where he was raised by his aunt on a farm. Clark tells us that his aunt had been a music teacher in Boston until one day she had taken a holiday in the Green Mountains of the Vermont, her family's ancestral home, and had met the narrator's uncle Howard and eloped with him. So, this is the story of Aunt Georgiana. She had met this person called Howard and had moved or eloped with Howard. They had set up their own home in a remote part of Nebraska And Georgiana had adventured far beyond her homestead in the last 30 years of married life. So once she was married with Howard, she never moved out of Nebraska or the place where they settled, and she was living her life in Nebraska. So after 30 long years, she is returning back to Boston for this particular thing that she had to do in the city. So what Clark decides for her is, very special, and it is very sweet. He takes her to her hotel and then collects her the following day, wanting to take her to see a Wagner opera in the afternoon to repay her for all that she did for him while growing up. So the titular word or the opera that you can see, Wagner opera. So he decides, as she was once before marriage, she was working as a music teacher, and Clark was quite aware of the fact that she was quite passionate about music. So he decides to take her for this Wagner opera. She seems timid and half asleep to find herself back in the city where she had lived and worked decades before, but she agrees to go to the opera with him. So although she finds it quite strange to come back to the city and find herself in between that bustling city, she was living in a farm. So it was quite difficult for her at first, but she agrees to go to the opera with him. And she proceeds to look around at everything in an impersonal and expressionless way and seems out of place in her country clothes. And this also startles Clark to a an extent, because he expected her to be excited for all the things that he was planning for her, but she seemed expressionless or emotionless in many ways. So Clark, the narrator, takes his aunt Georgiana for this opera, and as the orchestra and singers begin to perform a selection of pieces from the Wagner's operas, tears appear in Georgiana's eyes, and this causes Clark to cry too. So until then, who was quite emotional, it is not the case then, because she begins to express her emotions, and she tells him that she had heard one of the pieces before. From a young German cowpuncher who had come to work on the farm where she was living and had sung the prize song. That is one song from the Wagner's opera. It is from the Wagner's, the master singers of Nuremberg. To her, this boy had sung the prize song for Georgiana, and he had once performed in Beirut for Wagner's opera company too. So the young man, however, had subsequently left the farm. So the story ends where Clark's aunt remains very emotional throughout the rest of the matinee. And when the performance has finished, she tells Clark that she doesn't want to go home. So the story, it ends with this dilemma of Aunt Georgiana, whether to actually leave the city and go back to the very monotonous life that she had in the farm, or to stay in the city and have all the color that once she used to enjoy. So that's it for today's class. Thank you.